Hello everybody, I'm John with JP Strategic Investments, and today we're going to go over Patriot One's recent investor webinar. There's a lot to get into here, and I'm going to start off with the big news that Peter opened with, which is that they have closed 4 contracts with customers since the beginning of April. This is obviously great news for the company and shareholders because it means that we're finally going to get some revenue coming in that's not from extract. And Peter then goes on to explain in a little more detail the size and type of these contracts.
Since the beginning of April, I'm very pleased to say we've signed 4 long-term contracts. Or said in another way, that's about 1 a week. These are kind of a reflection of the activity we started in January to get very, very focused with our sales and marketing efforts on those places where there were customers who had the highest propensity for our solutions. So fast forward from January to April, here we are. These are contracts in our key target markets. This is all part of that strategy of focus on those markets that are best suited for our solutions and not chase everything. The deals include casinos. These 4 deals include some casinos and venues for 2 pro sports leagues and teams. These contracts also vary in size. Some of them are very simply 2 MSG lanes. Some of them are 6 MSG lanes. Some include VRS solutions, some don't, right? So the nice thing about this is we're seeing a nice mix, but very good fit for those customer markets, right? So in some cases, though, this is a first step in a deployment. So for example, with one of the pro leagues, this is a first location, but there's an opportunity potentially for upside as we continue to work with that customer as they look at more entries within the venue. The sales cycle to me is interesting also. These deals range from about 90-day sales cycles, for some of the smaller deals. In some cases, they're more like 150 days to get closure, but those ones are a little bit longer and more complex with more complex customers. They're, again, for the first phase of the deployment, and we'll talk about those next phases after the first one's successful. One thing I do want to clarify, though, when I talk about these contracts, I'm happy to talk about them, right? For clarity, for our investors, don't expect an immediate massive pop in revenues. We would consider these to be relatively small contracts as we think about the business, but that's okay. Success is not just about, installation of technology, but it's making sure we've got the right fit for those customers to ensure a successful deployment.
So the first thing I noted here was that Peter refers to these contracts as long-term contracts, although he doesn't give an actual contract length, and that's something I'd really be interested to know. The next thing that was actually really helpful was that Peter did go into a little more detail on the product mix of these contracts. He says that some of them included only 2 MSG lanes and some included 6 MSG lanes, and he also mentions that some of them include VRS and some of them don't. Another thing that's important to note here is that he mentions that some of these contracts essentially meet the entire needs of the venue, while others are only the first step in multi-contract phases. All of this information will be really helpful in evaluating the upcoming earnings in June, where we should start to see some of the revenue show up on the income statement depending on how they go about reporting the revenue from these contracts. The next thing I want to go over here is the comment that Peter made about the ident mods. He mentioned that just this last month they had their first sale of mods.
All right, and have any mods products been sold to date?
Yeah, the first order was this month, and it was with one of the pro sports leagues.
Now, this is really good to hear, but I do have some questions regarding the mods because I had originally thought that the mods were going to be something that was more of a rental model than an actual sales model. The whole idea of the mods seemed to be that they are portable and easily set up and taken away. Also, the examples that Peter gives in the previous webinar are more of a county fair that's only at a location for a month, but they need security and so they can rent the mods for that time period. Now, Peter does mention that the sale was to a professional sports team, so I'm curious whether this was a long-term rental or whether the sports team is actually buying these mods because they may have several different locations where they need security and they don't want to buy security for each location, and this way they can easily move their mods around to each location as needed. The next thing I want to touch on here is the company's cash burn. I noticed that there was a lot of questions in the chat section of the webinar, and I've seen several people talk about this, so I just wanted to give my thoughts on that. As of the last quarter, the company's current cash burn rate is about $3.6 million per quarter. And I get that by taking the comprehensive loss of $3.1 million and adding back the $500,000 in COVID relief funding that the company received in that quarter. With the company currently having roughly $14.3 million in cash on the balance sheet, that means that excluding COVID relief funding, if the company made absolutely no money, they could probably survive for the rest of the year. That being said though, we do know for a fact that there is going to be at least some money coming in. Obviously, we have the 4 contracts that were just announced, and while we don't know exactly the total value of these contracts, we do know that at least some money will be coming in. We also have at least 2 extract contracts that we know about that total to about 1.4 million, and on top of that, it looks like there are going to be future contracts for MSG and VRS signed in the near future. Finally, there will likely be a small amount of COVID funding for the next quarter or so, and Peter did mention that he was open to the idea of raising capital. Now, as far as raising capital goes, generally I would prefer that the company didn't raise capital because it would likely dilute shares in a meaningful way. With all of this in mind though, I think we'll have a much better idea of how strong the company's balance sheet is when we find out the size and length of these contracts that were just announced. Hopefully we'll get to see some of that in the earnings report in June, and depending on whether or not they decide to give guidance going forward, we should have a much better idea of how strong the company's cash position actually is. The last thing I want to touch on here is Peter's answer to the question of insider ownership. As far as I can tell, according to public records, none of the current executives have bought any shares in the company. And usually as an investor, it's nice to see the executives buying shares because it means that not only are they bullish on the stock, but now they have something to lose if the stock drops.
All right. Can you comment on the limited insider ownership?
Yeah. Look, my salary, my management salary, let me change that. My compensation, the executive team's compensation is like a combination of short and long-term, activities or mix. The bulk of my compensation is in, shares, right? And it's directly tied to the success of the company. So if the company is successful, we get compensated, right? Our interests are entirely aligned with the success of Patriot One. That's how we're compensated.
So it's great to hear Peter say that a large part of his compensation is tied directly to the success of the company and comes in the form of shares or stock options. Now, as far as the stock goes in relation to this webinar, I am a bit surprised that the stock didn't jump a little more than it did, but I think the main reason we didn't see a larger jump here is because most Patriot One investors are waiting to see what these contracts actually amount to, and then they can evaluate how good this is for the company. Personally, I did add to my position a little bit, but I am in the same boat as many of these investors where I really do want to see the numbers and how much these contracts actually amount to. I hope you guys found this analysis helpful, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, don't forget to leave me a comment below letting me know what you thought of this webinar or if you have any questions. Other than that, see you next time and have a great day.